Good morning, First Presbyterian. I'm so excited to be with you again. I was asked to speak again on the topic of friendships and how they change from childhood to adulthood and what that looks like. I was very excited to talk about this subject as friendship is one of those things that I think changes over the course of our lifetime and deepens and grows as we grow and deepen in our own humanhood. So at first I wanted to kind of take us back to when we were all children and think about what was important to you as a child. Oftentimes, I think it was proximity was a helpful thing. Like, I distinctly remember running next door to the girls next door and knocking on their door and seeing if they wanted to come out and play, and the boy on the corner and knocking on his door and seeing if he wanted to play. And oftentimes it culminated in kickball games in the middle of the street on a summer's night. I have a few very, very vivid memories of a neighborhood-wide kickball game and playing TV tag. I actually suffered a broken leg while playing TV tag with the boys next door. One of my proudest moments of running into a tree and breaking my leg when the summer between kindergarten and first grade, which is an excellent time to have to learn to walk on crutches. But in talking about that and sharing about that, there's such an innocence to those relationships. There's, for me in particular, I know we talked a little bit last time. If you watched the video from last time, I briefly talked about like childhood trauma, and thankfully, my childhood was fairly free from those things. So when I think of childhood friendships, oftentimes there's a lot of innocence that comes along with those. Also, as we age through our developmentally, oftentimes we just want people who aren't our parents, who relationships that are meaningful and passionate outside of our relationships with our parents. There's the song, I couldn't tell you when it came out, but the lyrics were something along the lines of "parents just don't understand." And oftentimes we as adults often forget about what it's like to be a teenager and those big, passionate loves, our first love, and how heartbreaking that was, and how essential it was to be in relationship with other kids our age. And oftentimes those relationships were we had groups of friends that developed around certain interests. I particularly remember there were my church friends who I spent time with at church and at church activities. I always gravitated towards a certain number of people. And then as I went to school and there were my band friends and my theater friends and obviously I am not the most athletic of humans. So I didn't have a lot of sports friends, but I loved going to sports games. And I had people that I went with and people that I showed up and cheered for. And a lot of times we get to try on those different personas a little bit. We get to see the side of us that maybe is a little bit more outgoing and maybe a little bit more dramatic as a theater kid, or as a sports kid. It gets to be like those super focused, maybe more driven camaraderie type relationships. And then, for me, for church, it was, there's this thing that is a part of my life that I don't get a lot of understanding from groups of people at my church. Like, they all attended church, but maybe didn't have that depth that my family engaged in as far as like religious involvement and the faith that we as a family practiced. So I think those are some of the things that it's so interesting to think back on those relationships from when we were younger, and think about the things that were important to us, and kind of starting to identify, when did those things start to change? When did I look back at relationships and notice there's like this depth to that starts to develop in relationships? Or maybe I'm starting to say goodbye to some of those childhood relationships. And what point does that happen? When do we start to break off, maybe, or leave certain things behind? There were three kind of things that I kind of identified as being major changes in relationships. The first being transitions. So what I mean by transitions is going off to college. I moved 4 hours away and went to college. A lot of my high school classmates stayed and went to Kirkwood, or stayed and went to a place close to home. And I made this big choice to shift away from my home. I kind of went on an adventure that was a little bit different than the path most of my classmates took. And so I think, and that echoes several points, or is mirrored several times throughout our adulthood. I think we oftentimes have several transitions that we hit, but like when we get into a committed relationship, when we get married, when we start having children, these are major transitions that we experience in our life. And I think oftentimes relationships shift with those things. So not even from childhood or teenagehood to adulthood, but with transitions and the things that are important to us in our life. The second of these ideas that I kind of identified were boundaries. I can think of so many things that I started to create boundaries around within my own life. Like, I'm not somebody who's ever like always accessible to the people in my life. Whether that's like, I don't always answer texts right away, or I don't, and I'm not saying this of all relationships, but boundaries are essential. If you watched my last video, you know that I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in the Cedar Rapids area. And that requires a lot of boundaries. Oftentimes, with like my clients are people who I'm like, oh my goodness, I would totally be friends with this person if I wasn't their therapist. But that's the type of relationship we have. So I have to kind of create that distance in that relationship so that we can do the work, so that we can focus on the purpose. And oftentimes, we develop or maybe grow in relationships at different times. So we have to create these boundaries between some of our childhood friendships and our adult friendships. One of those things being, I stopped partying much earlier than I started later and stopped earlier than a lot of my friend groups. So it kind of put some pretty harsh boundaries in some relationships, because some people didn't understand why that was important to me to create that divide. Other folks didn't necessarily, there wasn't a whole lot of understanding. Like, if we're not going to go out and party together, then, you know, that's the only thing I do for fun. So sometimes boundaries that we place in our lives tend to change relationships as well. And then the last kind of I touched on with the boundaries as well is values. Sometimes our values are just so stark from one another that it makes our childhood relationships unsustainable as adults. Oftentimes, and it's not even just like good or bad values. It's speaking back to my high school class, I graduated in a class of a whopping 55 students, and by the time I graduated, like more than half of my class were already engaged or had kids or were already in that stage of their life. And I'm going to be 35 next month, and I don't have a long-term partner or children in my life. My focus to this point has been my education and my career, which is so important to me. And I think I've shared that in both in my last video and hopefully it comes across how important my work is to me, even in this video. But I think as those values shift or change, or the things that we place emphasis on, we're going to see maybe a shift in relationships, or a shift in who we're spending time with, or things of that nature. There are some relationships that stand the test of time. I believe I mentioned the fact that I graduated from a small high school. I actually didn't go to that school until I was in 7th grade. So at this point, the school that I went to had 2 elementary schools, and then all of the kids were shuttled together for 6th through 12th grade. So when I arrived in 7th grade, they'd already all known one another. And prior to that, they'd all played each other in like little league sports. And because again, small town Iowa, those are the things we do in the summertime, right? Is we play sports. So I had kind of missed out on that connection point that a lot of my classmates had. So in coming in 7th grade, I was a little bit lost. And there was a girl who nobody talked to me my first day until lunchtime. You went and ate lunch, and then there was a little bit of a free period. It wasn't recess because you were in middle school now, and you're too old for that. But we were able to stand outside in this little parking lot out back of the school, which is still there. I was actually in Troy Mills for my niece's softball game, and I was like, I remember standing in that parking lot. And anyway, lots of memories came back. But this girl walked up to me and goes, "Hey, what sports are you playing?" And of course I told her, like, I only really had any interest in softball, and that wasn't being played till the following summer. But that girl, that was in August of 1998. That girl, 22 years later, is still my best friend. So that relationship has kind of been able to navigate so many of the transitions that we went through in our life, our changing boundaries, and what it meant for us to be good friends, and our values. I would say even now our values are kind of different, but we found ways to connect despite those things. And that's what I'm moving to. My last point is I kind of picked out a few relationships or a few friendships that are seen throughout the Bible, and what were kind of the hallmarks of those relationships. The first being David and Jonathan. This is such a hallmark relationship for me. Both of the first two are, in that but the first one especially so, is we don't often see intimate friendships between men encouraged in our greater culture. And I think David and Jonathan were a wonderful example of a very intimate but friendship. And And one of the things that I, when I think of that story, I think of the massive sacrifice that Jonathan had to make in saying, like, I know you need to leave. I need to protect you from my father, and I know you need to leave. So he gave that space that was needed. And I think of that as being so powerful. Like, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about this idea of having to let go and creating this space between himself and his best friend, because it was literally to save his friend's life, but the sacrifice that was needed in that moment, in that friendship, like the sacrifice of the space that was made. And I think, and oftentimes, and as we navigate relationships as adults, we find that need for space. We find that, you know, even in our marriage partners, like oftentimes we need space from one another. We need distance. And often in this particular case, it wasn't a choice necessarily, but it was a necessity. And I think that's what we can take away from them, that oftentimes, even if it feels uncomfortable, we need to create space with our friends, and find that. So that's a hallmark of an adult relationship. The second being Ruth and Naomi, two women who bonded over the grief and disappointment and loss, and the faithfulness that was present in this relationship, and they moved through life and made this massive change together. And then we see Ruth rewarded for her faithfulness. We see this introduction made that changed her life and the life of the Hebrew people forever at that point. And then the last relationship that I wanted to point out this evening was Barnabas and Paul. Sorry for that. But Barnabas and Paul, like, what do we know of? We know we met Paul when he was still Saul and when he was persecuting Christians, and Barnabas, being the leader of the church, demonstrated tremendous forgiveness in not only creating a space of forgiveness, but then a space for Paul to then be a leader. And one of the things that I can remember hearing in a talk several years ago, maybe even in college, was how the shift went from Barnabas and Paul to Paul and Barnabas. Like, they're shifted, like, the importance of the early church to these two men, even though they were both very much cornerstones of the early church, that even if Paul took over that leadership, that relationship was still so valuable. But they navigated those changing values so respectfully, and so maybe not smoothly. Like, obviously the Bible is not an exact narrative of these relationships, but can you imagine? Can you imagine being friends and putting in leadership somebody that you disagree with at the very core of who you are? I can't. Like, so I think in reviewing these three relationships over the course of the Bible, giving David and Jonathan teaching us how to create space for one another, Ruth and Naomi teaching us both the power of shared experience, but the faithfulness that we can have with one another, and lastly, Barnabas and Paul, forgiveness and changing and navigating changing values. The power present in those relationships is immense. And hopefully we can learn from those. Hopefully we can learn how to navigate not only from childhood to adulthood, but through changing life experiences as well, like we all deal with on a daily basis. But again, I want to thank you for having me back. And I hope the words that I brought to you today were helpful in exploring and developing your own relationships. Thank you.